Hi and welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about third-party checks. So let's get started. What is a third-party check? A third-party check is a check in which the original payee endorses the check and then transfers the right to deposit that check to another person. So let's cover why it's called a third-party check. And to discuss that, let's talk about two-party checks. So normally a check has two parties, so that would be the payer, so that's the person who is writing the check, and then the payee, the person who is receiving the check. With a third party check, you now introduce a third party. So you go from the payer to the endorser, which was the original payee, to now a new payee. So now you have three parties on that check. The important part is that in a two-party check, the payee is the original payee, and in a third-party check, it does not match the original pay in the order of on that front of the check. It is now being delivered to a third person. How do you sign over a check to somebody else? So in order to sign over the check to somebody else, the original payee still has to endorse the check. So endorsing the check means that you will on the back sign where it says sign here or endorse here. So that is where the signature goes. In that space, then you will write paid to the order of and then list the new payee's name. And then when you give the check over to the new payee, then the payee has to endorse it also on that back side. So instead of having one endorsement on the check, you'll now have two endorsements on the check. What type of checks can be turned into third-party checks? Well, technically any check could potentially be turned into a third-party check. This could include personal checks, business checks, government checks, payroll checks, cashier's checks. Sometimes you can even do it with money orders, etc. The difference is that not every bank will accept a third-party check of all types. Also, there might be restrictions on certain checks to be able to turn them into third-party checks. So you kind of have to pay attention to the original bank that you are having on that check, because some will have policies in which a certain check amount cannot be turned into a third party. Some will have a restriction. This is usually the case for certain government checks where you cannot do a third party endorsement. So that means it can only go to the person that is on the check or the business that is on that check. And so those are things that you have to pay attention to, but technically almost all checks in a way could be turned into third party checks. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but I hope that makes sense. Do all banks take third party checks? No, not all banks accept third-party checks. You have to check to see with that bank if there are any policies. Sometimes there are amounts restrictions. Sometimes there is like you can't do it if there's too many endorsements on the check, because yes, you can endorse a check multiple times. It just gets fishier and fishier every time it gets done. There are some banks that have policies where the original payee has to be there as well to sign the check and give over their ID as verification that they are the technical recipients of that original check before they sign that over to you, etc. It varies again with the banks. And this is not something that is commonly done anymore, but it is still a potential option, which is why I bring it up in these videos. So why are third-party checks useful and what are their use cases? Well, for some people, it just saves them time. So instead of having to deposit that check and then write out a new check for the same amount to somebody else, they can just transfer it over and it just saves them a little bit of time. For some, it also allows for the avoidance of voiding out a check or canceling a check. Another use case, and one that I personally have had experience with quite a bit, was that it allows for health insurance payments or those reimbursement checks to, instead of going to the patient, just go directly to the service provider or the healthcare provider. So when I busted my shoulder and I was still under my dad's insurance, they would write out a check to my dad, but then we would third party check it, so he would endorse it and then pay in the order to the physical therapist. That is something apparently that is really common with certain insurances, where they will write and cut out reimbursement checks to the patient instead of just paying directly to the service provider. Why? I'm not sure. It's just something that they do. What are the pros to third party checks? Well, one is convenience, because it saves you time in the sense that you don't have to deposit it and then write out another check. But there's also the argument that you could be using it in emergency situations, because you can provide pretty immediate financial assistance if you have like a payroll check that you haven't cashed and then you have a family member that needs it immediately. You could just third party it instead of trying to wait for the money to be deposited into your account, especially if there's a hold, and then transfer it over to them. What are some cons to third party checks? Well, one is that there is a fraud risk. There is the potential liability that the original payer wasn't intending on paying or allowing that check to be endorsed to a third party and therefore paying a different individual. And so that is something that potentially can lead to some consequences. Another thing is that if a check is already cashed and then people keep it, then somebody might try to turn it into a third-party check by endorsing it a second time to deposit it to themselves, and that wouldn't work because the funds were already distributed, but it might potentially take some time for the banks to figure that out. So it is more likely to lead to fraud and risk than being legitimate, especially now in today's age. Bank policies. So some banks, because of the fraud risk that I talked about earlier, just refuse overall to accept third-party checks. It is something that can be done, and it is also something that might be restricted. So it's always important to call the bank and find out whether or not they accept it. Endorsement issues. So if you do not endorse it the right way, then the third party person will not be able to cash it. And if that's the case, and then you don't talk to that middle original payee, etc., there's just a lot of potential situations where it doesn't pan out. Also, if you mess up with how you endorse it, well, then the check might look too altered for crossouts, etc., and then the bank may just be like, no, I'm not going to accept it, and in which case you'll have to have the check reissued originally, and it's again a pain. The last one is the potential hold or delay. So some banks will have policies in which third-party checks may have an additional hold on them, and that's again just to give the bank more time to determine whether or not the check is fraudulent. So yeah, that's the basics around third-party checks. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give this video a like. For those who are subscribers, thank you for tuning in. And for those who are not subscribers, I hope you thought this video was helpful and that you'll consider subscribing. I try to post a video weekly, and it's either about a personal finance topic or it's about my family's debt progress. And so I hope to see you on the channel. And until the next video, bye.